best practices for creating and maintaining add-on products for Plone. Thank you for coming to the very last session of the Plone 2008 conference. Way to go. This talk is not for core developers. I'm going to be talking about pretty broad stroke stuff. I'm talking generally about add-ons, what we used to call products, although I'm kind of conflicted about whether to call them products anymore. Plone products that either alter the appearance or add basic content types to Plone. And as such, this will be a code-free talk. You don't have to look at any more really small font code. Although if you do have any questions about any of the particulars, please ask me, especially if I'm not being specific enough, because I'm going to go pretty high level. Just to see who you all are, how many of you have actually created a file system product of some kind for your own uses? Okay. And how many of you maintain or have engaged in stuff that's publicly available in the collective on plone.org or anything like that? Okay. Cool. Well, if I'm being too patronizing, let me know in some way, maybe a tug in the ear or something like that. So a little bit of background about me. I work for an organization called One Northwest, and there's 5 of us here at the conference. We're the entire web team of a nonprofit environmental organization that does websites for other nonprofit environmental organizations. It's our mission to help them engage people around the environment. So a large part of that is building websites in Plone. We've been doing that for about 4+ years, and I've been doing it that whole time with them. As a way to intro this particular talk, a little more history is probably in order. Since we started in about 2004 doing the Plone sites, we now have about 45, this isn't super scientific, but somewhere around 45 Plone 2.0 sites, and 35 more Plone 2.1 sites, and then 45 some Plone 2.5 sites, and then 35 and growing 3.x sites. Our policy is to create your site and then not preemptively upgrade it, which works for us and it works for the clients. And what this has meant is that after a couple years or after a couple months of usage, the client usually comes back to us and says, we want smart folders, or now known as collections, or we want some other functionality that's only available in newer versions of Plone, or whatever. We're doing lots of migrations. And that basically caused us to revisit some of the travesties that we did in our early days. There are lots of kind of dinosaur products lingering that make upgrades really difficult. And so part of what I want you to take away from this is how to not make these migrations tough for other people in the future, if nothing else. Oh yeah, and my experience with third-party products is primarily around three pretty primitive basic ones. A super lightweight blog called Scrawl, a relatively cool slideshow application that turns a folder into a slideshow, a folder of images, and then a press room type media kit application. So before you think about really creating a third-party product, a quick sanity check's probably in order. You want to make sure that that if there's something out there that does the same thing, you want to make sure you shouldn't be focusing your energy helping build that instead of creating your own. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't have competition, because that definitely has improved the situation. If you see, if you compare the old visual editor EPOS with Kupu, it was good that there was a little bit of competition in there. But if you compare that, if you alternatively look at the blog situation, there's a pretty diluted and cluttered landscape there, and it's not really clear what the best option is for the casual person who wants to create a blog in Plone. And also, you want to make sure that you have time to babysit this thing once it's through. I think everybody finds the fun part up front, and then it's everything after that takes the real work and the dedication. So assuming that all passes, then you want to actually create your product. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. That gets a lot more technical, but issues to consider as you're actually coding is to make sure that this is not a destructive product. This is what we it took us, I think, probably a full year to realize that actually you need to test these products in a sandbox, like on your own machine, and not on production sites. And if you, I won't tell any war stories about that, but there have been destructive side effects from untested products making it onto production sites. All that can be helped if you make sure that the product that you create can uninstall without leaving any crap anywhere, and that takes a little bit of testing. It's a great case for unit tests, and I'll be talking more about testing later. But the first test you should write for any of these products is that, number one, it installs all the things you care about it installing, so JavaScripts, style sheets, portal properties, portal skins, all that sort of thing. And then for each test that you create in that department, you make an uninstall test that makes sure that it gets rid of that crap when you're done. If you look at a lot of our 2.0 sites, there's just all sorts of skeletons from products that no longer exist and are no longer maintained and are no longer on that Zope instance, but they're still kind of cluttering up the site. In the plone 3 world, there's a new danger that I've seen in a few instances, and that's where if you register some of these new Zope 3 type utilities or views and stuff like that, that it affects every single plone site within a Zope instance, and that's really scary. That's really dangerous. Our hosting model is built on the idea that we put 10 to 30 sites plone sites in a Zope instance, and we'd really rather not have that side effects trickling down for every product that we add in. There's a technology called browser layers that I think weren't part of Plone until 3.1. I think you had to add that specially, but now it's there, and anything you add should be using browser layers to make sure that it's only available when explicitly installed. And finally, you should make sure that reinstalls don't do crazy things. There's a hook in install.py. Sorry, in the install method that usually is in install.py that lets you know if it's going to be a reinstall as opposed to a clean initial install. So you want to make sure you're not adding things twice that already exist and that sort of thing. Obviously, if you're doing a product, you don't know really what environment it's going to be installed into, and you need to make sure it's not going to be stepping on other people's toes. Part of playing well with others means not reinventing the wheel in terms of existing Plone paradigms, naming conventions, CSS classes, all those things. I was seeing some recent applications on OS 10 that were very jarringly not like OS 10 applications. And the same sort of thing happens when you're in Plone and it doesn't look like Plone. You're like, wow, that doesn't look like Plone. So there are conventions that we have with CSS classes with all sorts of styles that's easier to hook into, especially the CSS styles that are driven by the properties and base properties. If that rings any bells, use those. That makes things look similar, and it makes it easier for people to change colors and styles in one fell swoop and have it affect your product as well as the rest of the Plone site. I'm getting into there are a couple of Zope 3 type technologies that also make things easier to customize and easier to play well with others if you use viewlets to inject templating instead of having custom templates that are harder to override or harder to integrate with more basic templates like main template. And finally, instead of creating extra content types, there are a lot of instances where you don't have to do that, and you can actually extend existing ones in various ways through technologies like subtyping and archetype scheme extender. I'm not going to go into that unless you have specific questions around it, but basically we're looking to allow your product to work with existing content and existing content types and not have it be able to uninstall without losing that content, and basically a less invasive way of adding new functionality. And if you have any questions about that, let me know now or later. In terms of planning for widespread use, there are lots of things you can do in a couple different arenas. I think by now you've probably heard a lot about unit testing. if you're lighter on the behavior, on the logic specific stuff, then they're not unit tests per se. You're probably talking about functional tests or browser tests or that sort of thing. But the more tests, the more people have confidence in your product. I don't know if people caught Hanno's talk yesterday about internationalization. Obviously, it's really good to build in all the hooks for that. I'm not saying you should translate your content because I'm an American. I know about one language, so I'm not translating anything. But allowing other people to translate more easily is going to get you bigger buy-in. Recently, there's been a huge push using ZC build-out to distribute all your products in eggs. There's a lot of documentation on plone.org about that. It basically makes it easier for people to test stuff out and to pull it down without and manage dependencies without having to go to plone.org every time to download your product. And finally, there's the issue of compatibility with different versions of Plone. Plone itself has traditionally kept itself compatible with 2 different versions of Zope at a time. I'm not even positive. Does it still do that? Yeah, everybody's nodding vigorously. So I think that's a pretty good model for your products to support 2 versions of Plone, 2 major versions of Plone at a time. So at this point, we're talking about 2.5 and 3.x. And for good examples on how to do that, check out Steve McMahon's Plone Form Gen. I've done it too with I think all 3 of the products that I've had a heavy hand in, like Scrawl and Pressroom, they support at least 3.0 and 2.5. There are some tricks to make that work. They're not super complicated. One is to make sure that you're not using super Plone 3 technologies. 5 does bridge a lot of those technologies in 2.5 and 3, but not all of them. And then in terms of detecting which version you're installing when it happens, it's pretty easy, and just by testing which modules you can import. I can't remember exactly which ones, but check out Plone Form Gen to see an example of that. And then what we usually do is we set up a skin folder for Plone 2.5 and then another skin folder for 3.0 that handles the differences in templates that you call viewlets in 3.0 and also support KSS inline editing in 3.0. So then at the very end of the installation process, you basically say, is this a 2.5 site? If so, remove the 3.0 skin from all the folder layers. And then it works in both versions. And obviously, this is a good thing to have tests for. Obviously, no matter how awesome your product is, people want to make it their own and brand it and change behavior and all that. Things to make that easier are, you've probably heard a lot already about separation of logic and presentation. It's both Plone 2.5 and 3.0 support browser views. Who all here have used browser views in their code? Okay, so not the newest thing. It's not very hard to do, and it makes it faster and more explicit, and obviously lots of good things. The alternative being Plone scripts or tools, which are outmoded. What else? There used to be a product called DIY Plone. Was it DIY Plone theme? Plone style. And it out of the box kind of dumped a ton of skin folders in your products, like 3 or 4 of them. And it's a little thing, but if you're going to customize some of these products, it's nice if there's only like 1 or 2 of those, unless there's really a ton of skin layer stuff, which more and more is being discouraged. So pay a little attention to that sort of thing. And so once you have your product and you're thinking about releasing it, there are a couple questions you should ask. This is the point of commitment, essentially, right? We have sort of adopted our own sort of strategy for products that are not probably ones we want to devote a huge amount of energy to maintaining publicly. And I don't know how sanctioned this is, but what we've done is we've uploaded our code to the collective, but we haven't really added an entry in plone.org. And I'm not really advocating that you use the collective as this dumping ground for your stuff. But there is a value in having stuff available to other people that you can point them to, but not making the public declaration that you're there to support it and that it's truly legitimate code. We've done that for at least one product. I think PayPal donation is up there. It's a super lightweight product that really doesn't merit a huge amount of fanfare, but is very useful for some of our older sites. And it's up there. It's free to use, but we're not making any claims about it. We're not really making any public avowal to support it and push its releases forward. In fact, I haven't touched it in a really long time, and it doesn't support anything probably above plone 2.1. But best case scenario is you have a product that is totally awesome and should be available to the world, and furthermore that you are totally ready to support for the next 3 or 4 years, right? If really you're getting to that point, then I get to all the preachy things, all the super preachy things about release management and about naming and all that. Alexander Leamy has a really awesome blog post called "The Namespace is Not the Product," I think, something like that, where he talks about how people are kind of getting bogged down in Python conventions and using lowercase names for the public discussion of their products, which makes it hard to read and makes it hard to Google. I'm not taking a super strong stand on that, although I generally agree with him in that. It is worth thinking about Googleability for your names. If you Google plone, you will find only content management stuff, I think, probably. If you Google listen, you'll probably find a lot of stuff. But one item that is under the heading of listen is a plone product. And there's probably lots of stuff that's not. And even if you Google plone and listen, you'll probably not find things that are purely about the newsletter product that the Open Plans project has created. Something to think about. And we have, John Stahl has written a lot more about this in an article on plone.org's documentation section for third-party advice. And I've updated that a little bit recently. It's worth checking out. It overlaps with this talk a little bit. Actually, a lot. Gare?
Stefan Holek of Old Plone fame, the inventor of Plone test case, has also written a really good talk a few years back called "Choosing Good Names." That he presented in EuroPython in 2005 or something like that. But it is online in his slides. So if you search for Stefan Holek "Choosing Good Names," there is a full set of slides on advice for choosing names.
Oh, interesting. That's good to know. Maybe I'll try to add that to that plone.org site that I was talking about. It already links to Leamy's rant. What I'm defining as releasing a public product is actually creating a page in the Plone Software Center, the plone.org/products area. It's a pretty well done section. It's really easy to create a bug tracker from there and to post all your releases, and it's basically the one-stop place to go to learn more about your product. I heartily encourage you to put your email up there as the contact so that people can inform you of issues, should there be any. I don't need to tell you documentation is super important. Everybody knows that. That includes maintaining a really good history.txt. And that also includes commenting your code really well. And when I say code, I'm talking in the broadest sense. I'm talking about putting comments maybe even in your generic setup profiles, like why you're including certain JavaScripts or why you have conditionals on certain style sheets. It occurs to me as I look back at some of the old stuff that I've written for specific clients that it's not really clear why I did things. So it might not be clear to other people as well. So the more comments, probably the better at some point. And then when I say good storage, that's kind of an awkward way of saying you should put your code in the collective for version control, and you should release the final product to plone.org as a tarball, and then also post it to PyPy, formerly known as the Cheese Shop, for egg distribution. I meant to mention earlier also that if you have an old school product, or if you're writing a somewhat old school product, it doesn't mean you can't eggify it. I think there's documentation on plone.org on how to turn that into a products.egg using that namespace that doesn't involve a whole lot of changes to what you've written, besides nesting it in a new directory. Oh, I also forgot to mention that if you post something to plone.org, and if you tag something in Subversion, please never, ever, ever delete it. People's build-outs might be depending on that code, and you should cut a new release, but don't delete the old ones. Pretty please. Release early and release often. Fix bugs and keep releasing so that people can be part of the evolution of your product. Oh, I guess here's where I said never delete releases. And the unglamorous part is all the maintenance afterwards, after your first release, and I think everybody knows what that looks like. It's good to keep a maintenance branch in Subversion, if nothing else, but probably also but also released point releases that contain support for older versions of Plone instead of dropping that entirely. Just like there have been a few releases of Plone 2.5x dealing with critical bug issues. It's good to keep some of those too if you have a product that is vulnerable like that. Chris?
Yeah, John, I was wondering, can you explain a little bit what the process of releasing looks like in the sense of having like a bunch of Sub3 eggs as your product is a collection of eggs and each of them have their own versions? I mean, how do you having a release is, I don't know. For me, it's confusing. I don't understand, you have a whole set of eggs that have their own versions and you're sort of creating some version that uses those eggs. This is, in the context of get paid. Like, now that we're all eggified, what's our next release look like?
I don't know if there's really consensus around that. The question was how, when you have a multi-egg scenario with a kind of broader, more ambitious product like Get Paid, how do you deal with point releases within those dependencies? Does anyone have a sense about that? I mean, there is sort of like a notion of like really what is a release of Get Paid itself, besides just a collection of interdependent eggs, and if you just break from that whole notion of this is Get Paid 1.0.
I think the only place that still has relevance is the tarball.
Right.
Really, everything else is. I mean, if you're using build out, then it's just whatever the recent.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer about that.
Okay.
I've never done anything that's that sprawling or ambitious. At least not since eggs have come along as the de facto distribution method. A couple other maintenance things to not forget. My colleague David Glick recently asked how many times when he did a grep on a build out of ours, how many times he found import the PDB and then set trace, and I can't remember. I think the number was around 19 in just a kind of random collection of products that we've been using. I think there was a justification for some of those that were in tests, but really that has no business going into Subversion. I think there's a check in Plone for Plone core code that won't let you do that, but the collective itself will let you check in that. That will really confuse a lot of people if you're setting breakpoints within your code. So try to avoid that one. And in general, you should be avoiding all SVN cruft in your actual tarball exports. So that means using SVN export instead of copying the code from your file system directly into your tarball. That will annoy people, but is not really fatal. Migrations, as Plone evolves, your product probably should evolve too. I think probably the best way to migrate serious code changes in your content is to hook into the install method of your product. It can detect reinstalls and do stuff accordingly there. I should note that when I refer to install.py, I'm assuming that you're writing products for plone 2.5 or you're supporting plone 2.5. After that, that became optional and everything was driven by generic setup. So, if you're not supporting 2.5, you don't have to worry about that, and you can catch reinstallation issues probably in your setup handlers. And on the code stewardship side, if you can't deal with the maintenance yourself anymore, if you've moved, say, out of the plone community, or if you just don't have the time, people would love you if you found a replacement, someone else to own the code and move on. And there's tons of instances where that has changed hands successfully. So I didn't make any real sweeping technological recommendations here about some of the ZOP 3 stuff, mainly interest of having compatibility for plone 2.5, but also just it's a little bit less about the code and more about the other aspects of what you write. For more information, I would highly recommend that you check out Martin's book, Martin Aspley's Professional Plone Programming, because it explains a lot of the newer technologies that we're talking about. And I'd also highly recommend that you check out Plone FormGen. Just look at the code, because Steve McMahon has done an awesome job of supporting multiple versions of Plone, and he's also done an awesome job of cranking out the versions and keeping it up to date and continually improving it. And it's like somebody's paying him to do it. So it's very impressive. So any questions?
Well, I came in late. Is collective PyPy, is that the same thing?
No, that's probably worth talking about. The collective is a giant subversion repository that most Plone code is checked into. And there's instructions on plone.org on how to get check-in rights to it. Basically, you get check-in rights to the entire repository. So once you have the permissions to do so, you can upload your code there and use it as free subversion, basically. PyPy is a separate thing. That's maintained by the Python community, and it's a point for distributing eggs. And I think you have to have a separate login for that, and you just upload in a single egg there and include some information about it.
If I develop my own product, I can upload it to PyPy. Why do I need the collective? What good does the collective do me?
It allows other people to contribute to your code if that's something that you want. That's the gist of what I'm talking about is code that can be contributed to by the larger community and benefit from that. There are cases where there's a lot of code that we don't make available to the collective because it has internal business logic or is proprietary in some way, and you don't use the collective for that. But anything that might benefit the community should be in the collective. Any other questions?
What's the URL of the collective again?
svn.plone.org
Okay.
/svn/collective. Yeah, there are a ton of links to it in plone.org documentation on how to get commit rights, on how it works. And if there's a couple different web UIs for it, so you can browse the wealth of code that's in there. There's a ton of stuff. Also, it's worth noting there are two other main subversion repositories for Plone, the Archetypes one and the Plone one. I think those have separate permissions. You have to sign agreements in order to get into those. And those are a lot more fundamental to Plone than the collective is. Any other questions? Alrighty, well, thank you.